So Acts 27 is kind of like a travel show. It's traveling with the Apostle Paul, the cruise edition. Apparently, the rest of you did not get the memo, hence the shirt. So yes, I look like I raided Ty Chu's closet, but he's not here to defend himself. So, but yes, so this is the travel channel with Paul. So let's just jump in at verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So notice right off the bat there, the word we. This means that Luke was physically traveling with Paul on this journey. So he was not writing this from secondhand information. He is an eyewitness to all the fun that they had on this particular cruise. We're also told here Paul is assigned another centurion. So this isn't the first time he's had a centurion watching over him, but we are informed of the centurion's name right off the bat and that he's a member of the Augustan cohort. So the Augustan cohort was a group of elite soldiers that were named in honor of Caesar Augustus. So if you were going to be named after or in honor of the Caesar, you had to be really good at what you did. Otherwise, you probably would disappear. So just as a reminder, a centurion was an officer in charge of 100 troops. If you got together 6 centurions and their troops, that was considered a cohort. Now, if the cohort was stationed in a place that was a higher risk, that could be increased up to over 1,000 troops. And then the bonus information, if you got 10 cohorts, you had a full Roman legion. So if you had a Roman legion coming after you, you were in a world of hurt. Centurions were officers, as I said. They were paid 5 times the amount of a regular enlisted Roman soldier. So why was Paul assigned a centurion, especially a decorated centurion like this, to guard him? That seems like it would be beneath the duties of a centurion. Well, it was common practice under Roman law that if there was a high profile or at-risk prisoner, they would be assigned a centurion. And even more so if that prisoner was a Roman citizen. So we've talked about Roman citizenship before. When Rome would take over a country, in this case, say Israel, the citizens of Israel did not become Roman citizens. They became Roman subjects. But if one of those subjects was wealthy and said, hey, I see the benefit of Roman citizenship, he could purchase a citizenship, but it was not a full citizenship. Full citizenship was only for citizens that were born Roman citizens, and Paul was one such citizen. So the reason that he had this centurion assigned to him was because it was a message. It said, Rome is protecting this person, mess with them at your own peril because any attacks on them are an attack on Rome and you might get that legion coming after you. Verse 2. And embarking on a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So Adramyttium was a large port city. Here they boarded what was likely a coastal vessel, meaning it sailed along the coast. It didn't go out into deep sea. And Aristarchus has traveled with Paul before. He's mentioned in Acts 19:29. So this is not his first journey with Paul. Verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. So God gave Paul favor with Julius the centurion. Perhaps Paul had been witnessing to him. I still find it interesting that as Julius was introduced, we get his name and a little bit of information about him. Most of the time when we're introduced to the centurions, they're a nameless background character. Here we know a little bit about him. So I have a hypothesis. Now, this is pure conjecture on my part, so don't stake any theology on it. But I wonder if Paul had been witnessing to Julius and Julius had accepted the Lord, or perhaps was a Christian before. So all of a sudden, he's a person and he's showing Paul kindness. Later on in the chapter, we see he saves Paul's life. As I said, completely my opinion, so take that for what it's worth. Verse 4. And putting out to sea, from there we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So this was a coastal ship, as I said. It was not able to handle the rough waves or strong winds. So sailing under the lee simply meant that it used the island as a block for the wind. Think about if you went downtown on a windy day, as you're walking next to a building, you don't feel the wind. But when you start crossing the street between buildings, you get smacked in the face with the wind. So the island was like that building blocking the wind for the ship. Verse 5. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. So it says after losing the shelter of Cyprus, they sailed more into the open sea. That's a little more dramatic than it sounds, as we'll see when we look on the map here in just a second. But once they arrived in Myra, they were changing ships. So if you guys could bring up the map, because it's map time and laser pointer time. So we can see here, here's Caesarea. Here's where they're leaving from. They sailed to Sidon over here. This was a day's journey. This is where Paul had some freedom. Then they traveled up here, this coastal vessel. So it went between the mainland and Cyprus. At the end of Cyprus here, they sailed across the open sea. So they cut across this bay. So that's what happened there. And here's Myra. This is where they changed ships at. We'll refer to this map a couple times just because there are events happening and I find it helpful to see on the map what's going on. Kind of just opens it up a little bit. And if you don't like maps, I apologize, but it's fun. And I get to use the laser pointer. So they boarded an Alexandrian cargo ship. Alexandria, Egypt was known for shipbuilding as well as grain production. So most likely their cargo was grain. This was a large wooden deep sea ship. So it was big enough to hold 276 people, we'll read later, as well as the cargo. So cargo ships are rated by tonnage, and that's basically the amount they can carry. So this one was rated around 2,600. And we don't have any pictures of the boats, unfortunately, but here's an illustration, if you guys could bring that up, what the ship likely looked like. So at the front, at the bow, there was a foresail. It was a single-masted ship here. And then this, it looks like a paddle. It's an oar. So there were two of these, one on each side. And this was big enough, as I said, to hold 276 people. It was a wooden vessel, and as it was loaded, it would ride deeper in the ocean. So it meant it could not go in shallow waters, otherwise it would hit the bottom. Verse 7. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. So right off the bat, we see they've changed ships and they're having difficulty traveling. The wind was not going in their favor. Remember, as you saw in that picture, it had a sail. The wind was the propulsion for this ship. Ideally, the wind would come from behind the sail and give them the best speed towards their destination. If it came at all towards the front, it slowed them down. Dead on would stop them or push them backwards. So they were forced to use Crete to block the wind, but they struggled along and made it to Fair Havens. So if you guys could bring up the map again. So here's Myra, where they changed ships. They sailed along here to Cnidus, and it says this was difficult. Then they came down and went to the south of Crete. Here's Crete, and this is Fair Havens right here. Now, the reason I point this out is they were going south. Normally, the journey would have come from Cnidus. They would have gone between Crete and Achaia, and then up here to Italy. So the wind was so strong, it completely blew them off course and very far south. Verse 9. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." So at this time, prime sailing season on the Mediterranean Sea ended mid-September. After that, the seasons were changing to winter and the weather was too unpredictable. It said after the fast. That refers to the Day of Atonement, which this year that Paul was in fell in October. So they were at least a couple weeks, if not close to a month, past the safe sailing date. So this put them really on the fringe of safe sailing. Now, Paul calls this to their attention. It doesn't say that God gave him divine notice. Perhaps he did. Or Paul was just using common sense saying, look, guys, we had a hard time just getting here. Are you sure you want to push your luck? Verse 11. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So Paul brought his concerns before everyone. He was simply outvoted. The centurion assumed the pilot, who was the captain of the ship, knew better. He would have been the experienced sailor. If he said, we can make it, it's logical to understand why the centurion would agree with them. Plus, the owner of the ship was there, and he wouldn't risk his investment in the ship haphazardly. Now, it also says that Fair Havens was apparently not a fair haven for winter. It doesn't tell us exactly why, but they do say that Phoenix faced different directions and was probably more suitable for shelter from the winter storms that came in. And Phoenix was known as a safe harbor for wintering in, so sailors often went there. So the sailors on this ship wanted to move on to Phoenix because it was more comfortable and had entertainment such that sailors would enjoy for the 2 to 3 months that they were going to be there. And on top of that, when we look at the map here for the last time in a second, it was very close. So logically they said, hey, maybe this is what we should do. Verse 13. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. So what they needed to make it to Phoenix was a south wind. So it began blowing gently, and they thought, this is it. Let's not miss our opportunity. Let's go. They jumped in the ship and began their journey. Now, how many here remember the show Gilligan's Island? Any hands? All right, there's a few of you. All right. I was going to play the intro, but I was afraid that some people wouldn't know what it was. And other than that, it was really long. It had been like 30, 45 seconds. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with, be comfortable in your ignorance. And those who do remember what it is, consider it some subtle foreshadowing on what is to come. Verse 14. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. So the wind blew them away from the island that they were supposed to be. It was supposed to be blocking them. It was sheltering them. Almost as if the island became a funnel that turned it into a wind tunnel that just hit the ship and blew them off course. They couldn't fight it, so they surrendered the ship to it and said, let it blow us where it will. So let's bring up the map for the last time. So here's Lycia, right here. Here's Phoenix. This is where they're trying to get to, right here. So you can see on the map, it's not very far. I believe it was around 50 or 60 miles. They were just going to sail right along the coast like the coastal vessel, but the wind blew them south. The last piece of land they see is this little island, Cauda, which we'll read about. And then the wind blew them out here into the open ocean. And the spoiler's right there. It says storm. That's where the fun really begins. Okay, verse 16. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. So they got a brief break from the wind from the island Cauda, and there they raised the ship's boat. So a large ship like that could not make it into a shallow harbor. So often what they would have to do is anchor in deep water and use a small launch to go from the big ship to the dock to ferry people or supplies. So what this verse is saying is that little boat that was with it had somehow gotten full of water, and it was probably throwing the ship off balance, so they needed to raise it up and secure it. Once they did that, it says they undergird the ship. They were basically strengthening it. So what they would do is they would drop a cable down one side of the ship, fish it under the ship, and bring it back up the other side and cinch it tight. So like kind of ratcheting it. And they do that at multiple points along the ship. Because remember, this is a wooden ship made of wooden slats, boards, They wanted to make sure all those boards were nice and cozy and comfy together, that there was no space in between. Because as the storm would batter the ship, if there was the slightest opening or weakness, the waves would exploit that and water would get in the ship. When enough water got in the ship, it transformed into a submarine, and it didn't end well for everyone. So they strengthened the ship. Then it said they feared they would run aground on the Syrtis. Syrtis was a large sandbar area that was known at that time as the graveyard of ships. So they knew if they hit that, the ship would become stuck and be broken apart, and they would all die. So they didn't want to do that either. Verse 18. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So the lower a ship runs in the water, the easier it is for waves to get over the edges or gunwales into the ship. Enough water gets in, and see that submarine we talked about again, it happens. So because the waves were so high, they figured they needed to lighten the ship so it rode higher in the water. Now this was a big decision because this is a cargo ship. Their business was delivering cargo and not to the bottom of the ocean. But at this point they said, we need to make sure the ship stays afloat. They threw the cargo overboard. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. On the third day, they threw the tackle overboard. The tackle was equipment that the ship needed to sail. So if you recall the picture, it had a mainsail in the center. During a storm, they would pull the sail down because the wind would destroy it, but they still had the crossbars on the mast and everything. All that stuff they couldn't use at that time that wasn't in use, they threw it overboard. Any extra ropes, pulleys, anything of weight. Now this was important because they needed this stuff to sail the ship after the storm. But at this point they said, if we don't get rid of this stuff, there won't be an after. We'll deal with the consequences. This was essentially their last resort, their Hail Mary, because after this, there's nothing they could do. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So even after preparing as much as they could, the storm continued to batter them. With no other options, they gave up. So this is the sailors who were experienced and knew what it was like to be on a ship. They said, hey, nobody's gonna come save us. We can't save ourselves. We're all gonna die. So I'm sure they were very cheerful with everyone, but they knew what they were looking at. Now, we can try to imagine this. We're reading the text and say, ooh, that sounds bad, but we live in Las Vegas, in the desert, in a state with no water. I mean, Lake Mead doesn't count. So we can only use our imagination or something we've seen in a movie unless somebody out there was in the Navy or on ships. So I'm a visual person. I like to see because it helps me understand. So I tried to find a video of what this looked like, but Paul didn't have a video camera. So I said, well, let me find another video just of a storm on the Mediterranean Sea. So I did find one. It's a modern cargo ship. Now, modern cargo ships are a little bit more advanced than what Paul was on. They're larger, they're constructed out of metal, they're sturdier, they have far better safety things for ballast and balance and things. Modern cargo ships range anywhere from a tonnage of 3,000 to over 20,000 compared to the 2,600 that Paul's was. Now, this ship, we only see part of it, so I don't know how large it is. It's likely larger than Paul's, but it gives you an idea. So guys, if you could play that clip.
Bırak. Kendini kolla, kendini.
So, short clip, fun. Who wouldn't want to be there doing that? Now imagine that magnified, because you could see the sky. It didn't look too bad, so maybe it was just windy and some larger waves, but you saw the angle of that ship. It was almost at a 45-degree angle. You heard everything falling. You didn't hear screaming and panic, so maybe they were used to it. But imagine that magnified with wind, rain, lightning for dramatic effect, and then going on for days. We're gonna read later, 2 weeks straight. So now you can kind of get an idea why these guys were panicking so much and giving up. Verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, You should have listened to me and have not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. So Paul decides it's a good time to stand up and say, I told you so. But fortunately, that's not all he has to say. Verse 22. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. So after the gentle reminder that Paul was right and they should have listened to him, he gives them some information. But this time it's clarified it's not Paul's opinion. This is divine revelation. Now, I find it very interesting how Paul introduces God in this statement. He doesn't say the God I serve, the God I believe in. He says the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. It's very possessive, but it's not in a negative, controlling, or mean sense. Think of it as a valuable treasure. In Genesis 1, it says that we were created in God's image. Jeremiah 31:3 says that God has loved us with an everlasting love. Zephaniah 3:17 says God is with us, delights in us, and even rejoices over us with singing. Romans 5:8 tells us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And Paul sums up God's love in Romans 8:38, if you guys could put that up. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, including storms, will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. So we are so loved, and that's so encouraging for us. But why do I bring this up? Paul was saying, I belong to God. I'm his precious treasure. He loves me this much. And he has said that I must make it to Rome to stand before Caesar, and all of you are coming with me. You're all safe. So Paul was using this to validate the message that he was given. And that same love is the same love that God has for us. God told Paul that no one on the ship would perish, but they would be shipwrecked. So I'm sure 275 people breathed a sigh of relief. The owner of the ship probably was a little disappointed with that last bit, but hopefully the prospect of surviving would make that a little bit less bitter of a pill to swallow. Verse 27. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So after 2 weeks of being driven by the storm, they sensed their approaching land. But they couldn't see because it was night, it was dark. So they decided to test the water, see how deep it was. A fathom was equal to 6 feet. So their first sounding was 120 feet deep. The second, a little bit later, was 90 feet. So I'm not that great at math, but I can see that 90 is less than 120. It was getting shallower. They decided to drop anchor and hold position because they didn't want to keep going and run into rocks that if they could see them, they could easily steer around. Verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. So at this point, some of the sailors said, hey, every man for himself. We know that the water is going to be shallow at this island. The small boat will make it, the big one won't. We're going to save ourselves, and you guys, good luck on the ship. God promised that they would all be saved with Paul. So Paul tells the centurions and the centurion and the soldiers, and they cut the ropes. Now, this wasn't simply because Paul didn't want to see them escape on their own. There was also common sense to this. If the sailors escaped in the small launch and left everyone on the ship, come daybreak, they would see what they needed to do, but there would be no one to pilot the ship because the sailors had left them high and dry temporarily on the ship, so they would still be stranded. So it was simple common sense that Paul was saying they need to be here so we can all be saved. Verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." So everyone on board had been on a diet of fear and probably nausea for the last 2 weeks. Even if they'd wanted to eat, they couldn't because the ship was being tossed so much. Here, Paul encourages them to break their fast of fear and eat some food. They were going to need strength. Paul reminds them that God had promised that they were going to be saved, and he keeps his promises. They were so protected that not one of them would lose a single hair on their head making it ashore. Now, they might all have white hair from the terror that they'd been through, but that white hair would stay on their head when they made it to shore. Verse 35. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So God gave Paul a message. Paul receives it and believes it. He shares it with everyone to encourage them. And Paul behaved like it was a done deal, as if it had already happened. Faith in action. Paul demonstrated his absolute faith in God in front of 275 desperate people. They ate and threw the last of the food overboard. They knew they were not staying on the ship and they couldn't take it with them, so they needed to lighten the ship as much as possible to try to get closer to land. Verse 39. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. So daybreak comes and they don't recognize this land. It's a strange land, but they're more than willing to get acquainted with this strange land because at this point, any land looks beautiful to them. So they cut the ropes from the anchors so the ship will move. They had tied up the rudders to keep the storm from breaking them. Now they loosen them so they can steer the ship and aim towards the beach. Verse 41. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. So even though they had returned the ship to full functionality, they struck a reef or a sandbar. The Greek word doesn't differentiate between the two, and they were stuck. This was a deep sea ship, so it just couldn't make it that close to the island. So what happened is the front was stuck, and the heavy waves were physically breaking apart the ship at the rear. And they couldn't stay there because it would be destroyed before long. Verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill all the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. So under Roman law, if a guard was watching a prisoner and they escaped, that guard paid the price with his life. So these soldiers were thinking, hey, let's be practical here. There's a chance one of these guys could escape, but if we kill them all, nobody will escape and we'll get to stay alive. So they figured, simple math, it's us or them, easily them. Verse 43. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So God continues to show Paul favor with the centurion, and he saves Paul from the plot of the guards to kill everyone. Everyone was ordered to abandon ship. Those that were strong enough jumped in and swam on their own. Those who felt they needed help were encouraged to take a souvenir from the ship, hug it close, and make for land. True to God's word, everyone made it safely. So this is the end of Acts 27, and as you could tell, it was less of a doctrinal or deep spiritual chapter like some of the ones we've read with Paul. It's more of a recounting of a historical event. And while it was a fun read, what can we today take away from it to enrich our lives and draw us closer to God now other than don't sail after mid-September in the Mediterranean Sea? Well, let's take a step back. Why was Paul on the ship in the first place? God wanted him to go to Rome. So Paul was obeying God's will. He was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do. But if that's the case, why was he going through all these trials? Well, God wanted Paul in Rome. Satan didn't want Paul in Rome. Now we know that Satan used people, Jew and Gentile, all through Paul's ministry to try to hamper it. Every chapter we've read, he's either running from someone or running to someone who wanted to kill him eventually. So in this case, the devil did use people at the end with the soldiers. It was a last-ditch effort to kill everyone. But the primary weapon Satan used was the weather in this chapter. So does that mean the devil can control the weather? Scripturally, yes. But only God is sovereign. If you recall the story of Job, it was a great wind that knocked down the house. And then there was another section where fire from heaven fell and caused calamity. But also in the book of Job, we're told that God set boundaries on what Satan could do. So Satan may have the ability to affect the weather, but God tells Satan what he can and cannot do. Satan may be the prince of the air, but he is limited. But this means that God allowed Satan to manipulate the weather to cause the storm and eventually a shipwreck. Why would God do that? Did he forget what his goal was? Was he playing games? No, not at all. God doesn't forget things and God doesn't play games. But Satan will sometimes say, as in the story of Job, let me try to mess things up. Let me prove you wrong, God. And God says, go ahead, give it your best shot, because God knows he can bring good out of whatever the devil has planned. Through these events, Paul was able to minister to everyone on that ship. Now you could make the argument, hey, they could have had a smooth sailing ship all the way to Italy and Paul could have preached sermons to everybody individually. And maybe that's possible, even though it's unlikely that all the prisoners had the freedom that Paul had to move about the ship. But say he could spend time with each person and witness to them. Those were just words. Going through what they went through, they got to hear what Paul had to say, but they also saw him put his faith into action. Satan blew them off course and blew them to an island that nobody had seen. But God saw that island, and next week Mike will cover the people on that island that God saw, and they needed to hear the gospel. So what Satan meant for evil, God turned into good. It's a Romans 8:28 moment. Now, we don't need to read Romans 8:28 because it's probably all of our favorite scriptures. Almost everybody here probably has that memorized. If you don't, memorize it because you'll be calling on it sooner or later. And speaking of calling, I'm going to call the worship team up now. So what we see in this account is that we can be doing what God has called us to do and still face trials and difficulties. Yet through these times, God is faithful 100%. He can bring even more blessings out of a trial than we can imagine. Satan is finite and limited. God is infinite, unlimited, and sovereign. No matter what is happening, you can trust God. Lean into him. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 11:1. This is Paul writing. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And Philippians 4:9 as well. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. I think the lesson for us tonight is to look at what Paul did and follow his example. He went through a tremendous trial, yet he did not focus on the storm. He focused on God. And when he received a word from God, he stood firmly on it and was not swayed to the left or to the right. Even if it feels like your ship is sinking, there's hope. God is in control. You could find yourself on a sinking ship, but you could end up going from a sinking ship to an island paradise. The journey may not be what you want. It may not happen in the way that you would like it to, but God is in control. So trust him for the destination. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for you. We thank you for the opportunity to dig into your word, to worship you. I just thank you for everyone here tonight. For those here that know you, Lord, I pray that you would encourage them and show them and remind them how much you love them, how you're with them through every situation and ready for anything that they can't even imagine. And for anyone here tonight who doesn't know you, I encourage you, if you don't know the Lord and you feel like maybe your ship is taking on water and you're concerned, it's easy. Just call out to him. Peter said, "Help me, Lord," and he was pulled from the water. So just call out to Jesus. He's already paid the price for you. You just have to ask him into your life and he can set you on the right path. So just pray and tell him that you need him and he's there for you. But I pray for everyone here tonight, Lord, guide us all safely home or wherever we need to go from here. Guide us on your way and help us to hear your purpose and your will in our lives. We love you and praise you. In Jesus' name.